Okay.
Good morning, everybody.
Morning. Welcome to Hacking the News. This is an Infosec guide to the media and how to talk to them, or alternatively, how not to talk to them, and how to run away from them. We three are all journalists. I'm Sean Gallagher. I'm the IT and National Security Editor at Ars Technica.
I'm Steve Ragan, Senior Staff Writer at CSO Online. I'm also manager of Salted Hatch.
And I'm Paul Wagenseal. I'm the Senior Security Editor, or Senior Editor, Common Security at Tom's Guide and Laptop Magazine.
So we're going to explain some things about the media, what exactly we mean by media and what the definition of media actually is, how you get your message out through the media if you are a researcher or doing other things in the field and you want to get attention, and other tips and tricks on interacting with the media. We heard you like examples, so we've added some examples in our examples. The key thing to remember as we're talking is that media is a lot like Infosec in that there's people with varying levels of skill and varying types of motivations. There are bad journalists, there are good journalists, and you need to be able to understand the skill set and the motivations of the people you're talking to when you talk to them or before you talk to them, so that you get your message across in the right way and you don't end up being used for something rather unfortunate.
Anyway, we're going to take questions at the end of this, which I'm sure there will be plenty of them. We will also be here all during the conference, just feel free to corner us. We gave an earlier version of this presentation at DerbyCon this year. And if you want to see that video, it's up on YouTube and the Internet Archive. And we also gave it at B-Side Las Vegas, where three people showed up, but that may be online as well.
But this one is much more fresh.
Yeah, fresh. Yeah.
So what's the media? Technically speaking, the media is any vehicle for delivering information, and the most common types are print and broadcast. That's what we define them as. So print is anything where letters are put on a page or a screen, and broadcast is voice, images, over the wire, over the airwaves. Reporters and journalists are the people who push information into those media forms. So media also includes, when we talk about print, for example, we're talking about also blogs and to some degree Twitter, because Twitter has become a media platform. If you all have blogs, you are essentially already the media. You may not be a journalist on a daily basis, but you are actually producing content that could be considered media. And social media is also media, because the trust that people put in people who they believe to be experts in the field, it makes them, in a way, journalists. And there's some side effects to that. Okay, so broadcast media. When you turn on the TV in the morning or you listen to the radio, that's broadcast media, or it could be a podcast, or it could be a YouTube channel. But for what we're speaking about, we're talking about corporate media in general. So with broadcast media, generally speaking, news is produced by a producer and not by the person who is reading the news on the broadcast. So when you see a reporter on the TV news, generally they have a producer who's put the story together for them, and they are just reading the script they got. In some cases, they're actually doing some journalism, but it's more common that they are just reading content they got that they were prepped for by their producer. Depending upon whether it's cable or local news and things like that, there's going to be limited slots to fill in these things, and so you're not going to get a lot of time with a particular story. The entire topic needs to be summed up in about 10 seconds when you're pitching these people, because really they only have about 2 minutes to present a story. Pardon me. So the problem also here is that very few producers in television or radio have any specific experience with any given field. There's no sort of beats for these people. So if you come to somebody with a security story in a broadcast medium, they're not necessarily going to have the expertise to really tell the story with any sort of nuance. So forget nuance when you have 2 minutes to do it in, and also expect that because of the way broadcast media works, if it bleeds, it leads. They'll be looking for the most controversial piece of a story in order for it to go forward. So I've had plenty of times when I've had a broadcast journalist come to me and ask me about a story and asked me for the controversy, and I've downplayed the controversy and the story hasn't aired. So they're more interested in things that are going to have a direct impact on their viewership and get people to hang on to watch the story through a couple of ads. So that's the problem with dealing with broadcast media, is that you have, again, limited time, limited amount of experience with the topic, and a need for controversy to drive story forward. With print, it follows a news cycle similar to what you see on TV now in terms of it's constantly going forward because of the web. So things have changed a lot in print. And when we talk about print, we're talking about magazines, newspapers, and websites. Most newspapers now have websites. Things have changed with the news cycle. It used to be that when something happened, it broke in print first, and then broadcast stole it and ran with the story again. Now it breaks on Twitter, it breaks on print, it breaks on broadcast, it breaks on print again, it goes back to Twitter, it echoes around. Again, most print journalists are generalists, but they tend to have more of a beat focus than people in broadcast. So especially people like us who specialize in security, we may not have any particular deep expertise in any particular part of security, but we cover the industry in general, we cover the topics in general, so we have more experience in dealing with this sort of topic than somebody who may be the general tech reporter at the New York Times or at another outlet. Again, if it bleeds, it leads. Most print publications are looking for some sort of controversy to get you to click. And if it's not going to have something that grabs the particular readership of that print media, it won't show up. Or it will, but it'll be buried deep in the newspaper, or it'll be deeper and deeper into the site. And another thing to think about when you're approaching different types of media, look at the publications and how they're structured, how the staff is structured. Some print journalists have a lot more freedom about what types of stories they can go after. For example, I don't have anybody tell me what I have to write. I go out and I pick the stories myself, I write them, and pretty much once I've written them, they go online. Other people may have to may get assignments from an editor, or they may have to clear a story with an editor before they can go forward with it. It may go through multiple levels of editorial approval before they can do it, and so they have less freedom about how they go after stories.
How many of you, show of hands, have pitched a story to the media before? Handful of you in the room, for those of you watching on the video stream. So when you pitch to the media, there are a couple things a reporter has to do. And we're going to talk about something called the smell test. And the joke I had prepared for this was, you know, it's 5 things, and number 4 is going to shock you. So when you're pitching to the media, you have to understand who the reporter is, what their publication is, and what they're doing. And the easiest way you can do that is by reading. Simply know who you're reading and who you want to talk to, and try to think about where your story fits into their ultimate goals or existence. So for example, you know that he does national security. Sean does. So if you had something related to national security, you're more likely to want to talk to him than you would me, because unless you understand what I'm writing, you would know that I would only cover national security if I could look at it as a broader concept, not just how it's going to affect the government, but how it's going to affect my mom and dad and other people in the public. So there are differences between us, even though we may both cover security. So the smell test that you see there is just a quick breakdown of how we go about checking a story. And it's not a new concept. You know, those who've been in the media for a while are kind of used to this roll through here, but it starts with the source. And what I mean by that is, who are you? Who are you? Why are you talking to me right now? what are you trying to convey, and how connected to this story are you? And then immediately following that, I've got to question your motivation. What is it you're getting out of this? Why are you talking to me? Is there something of a benefit to you in having this story come out? 9 times out of 10, when a pitch comes across my email and the person on the other end wants me to tell their story, their motivation is to promote their product or their company. This is not a huge national interest story or a public interest story. It's simply somebody trying to sell something. So the motivation right there is where I start filtering out news pitches every day. To give you an example, last week before I got here, I received just over 1,000 pitches in my email. Those of you who follow me on a regular basis know I wrote one story last week. It was a breaking news story about a data breach at a hospital in Georgia. I was not pitched that story. That story did not come to me via email. So out of those 1,000 emails I got, 0 of them became stories. I got my story last week because a source called me that I know, they are reliable, and they said, something strange happened. That's where that story came from. It didn't come from a pitch. So the evidence is actually what a lot of you understand the media to do. You know that when a story comes out, we have to prove what we're telling you. So is there evidence supporting the claims of the story? Well, when you're pitching things to us, the first thing we're going to do is look at the evidence. Does it support what you're saying? And then, of course, logic. So you've came to me with a pitch. You have some evidence. The evidence seems to support it, but does it logically support it? Probably. But if it doesn't, then we have to fix that. I have to go through and question why that is. And then the last one you see there is left out. This is critical. What is left out that's going to change the narrative of my story? So I've got your pitch, I've got your evidence, but what are we missing? What conclusively finishes off this story, or more importantly, what's left out that might change where we're going? We'll talk about some examples of how left out plays into things a little bit later, but it's really key that reporters ask this question and that you consider it when you're pitching. And the reason why is because left out isn't just a thing. Sometimes left out is a who. Is there a group of people being left out of this story? Is there a person that's greatly involved that's not being included, to where their insight might dramatically change how this story appears? Things like this are how we go about running through. Go ahead.
So I was just going to add that the left out part also is important if you're pitching a story, you're pitching something about a story that is already broken. I cannot tell you how many times I've gotten emails from people saying, hey, we saw you wrote this story about this breach. Our CSO would like to tell you his opinion about this breach.
Yeah.
Or our president would like to tell you how our product would have prevented this breach from happening. I don't care. Okay. I want to have some more information that extends the story rather than having commentary on the story. So if you have something that's left out about the story, if you have something that is a factor that hasn't been taken into account by other people who've already reported the story or commented on the story, that's what I want to hear. I don't want to hear your opinion on what happened and on the facts I've already presented. I want to hear more detail that helps expand the understanding of the story, helps people take action about the problem at the root of the story, and things like that. So that last part, left out, is critical if you're coming to me with a follow-on to an existing story.
And to relate that to this existing crowd, a lot of you are extremely intelligent in given areas of security. So when you see a story that's right up your alley, something you've covered or researched, immediately you want to jump on that and you want to talk and share your experiences and your knowledge. The easiest way to do that is to look at what's left out. You're experts in that field. So to give you an example, earlier this year I wrote a story about something and a researcher reached out to me and was like, I saw you wrote about this, but why didn't you mention X? And I said, well, what's X? And they're like, how are you covering this story if you don't know about X? Now, that may come off as harsh, but they had a valid point because X was not included in the narrative. And because this particular topic is not something everybody's familiar with, of course, unless you're deep into that topic, X is not something you looked at. So I got an education and a follow-up story because somebody reached out with what was left out and said, what about X?
So sometimes the reverse is true. Sometimes you will be cold called or cold emailed by a reporter. And you may wonder, why is this reporter coming to you? Generally, it's because the reporter's heard of you. You may have commented on a previous story at some other publication, and the reporter just picked that up and got your email address. Or you may have had a correspondence with this reporter before, in which case you're a guaranteed source. Often, frankly, when I have a story, I just email, cold call, probably a dozen people and see who responds. And if you respond, then I'm going to try to use you again. Often reporters will also want somebody, I mean, I don't do this, I want facts, but a lot of reporters want controversy, so they'll call somebody or email somebody who is known to give a controversial opinion, a contrarian opinion, something inflammatory.
Or they'll just take something that you posted on Twitter.
Yeah, that too. Anyway, everyone wants a good quotation, and I mean a good quotation, not a good paraphrase. They don't want to take what you said and rewrite it, because you can make a mistake that way. But generally, when a reporter calls you, he wants your opinion, your source, your take, and he wants a nice good quotation. So, but before you respond, especially if you work for a big, security company, you may want to talk to your PR people. I mean, you really should, because you should not be commenting to the press without your company's PR being involved.
Real quick, how many of you in here work for a company with a known communications department or PR agency representing it? All right, I want all of you with your hands up. You come up there real quick, and I want everybody else in the room to look. These are the ones who have supposedly had media training and everything like this. So if you've got your hands up right now, because you know that, put your hands down if you have not had media training. Who's got media training under their belt? Notice how quickly those numbers dropped.
Yeah.
That's a bad thing.
Right.
And it's not your fault, mind you. It's not. But that is exactly what we're talking about here. You should never talk to the media if you've got a comms department or a PR department, because that's their job, not yours. But sometimes you're going to be picked to be a representative, and if you're not adequately prepared, well, Paul, you want to move on? Paul, move on? Are you? You were, but I didn't know if you went ahead.
Oh, no, I mean, well, basically, back to the earlier point about dealing with media, one thing you got to remember is we are not your PR department. We don't do advertising for you. We don't want to really care. We don't care if your company suddenly made a lot of money or got acquired or has a new CSO. We want interesting stuff that's relevant to the general public. Some PR departments really don't take that to heart. They should. That's why we delete their emails.
So the worst in journalism is like the worst in Infosec. And what we mean by that is you've got good reporters, bad reporters, and everybody in between, just like we do in the Infosec community. That will shock none of you.
There are journalistic script kiddies.
Yes, very much so. And the thing is, a journalist will be able to spot a journalistic script kiddie really quickly, because we too got that same press release. So when I watch you cut and paste it and then publish it as an original story, you're a kiddie. So now we're going to get to the tips and tricks portion. And honestly, if you remember anything from this talk, this next slide is the only thing I want you to remember, okay? Get your cameras out. Because right now I'm going to talk to you about the difference between on the record, off the record, and on background, okay? These are three terms that every journalist knows, but sometimes the public doesn't understand. Now, those of you who were in here when we first arrived, we handed out some cards, and if you did not get one of those cards, see us after this talk and we'll make sure you get one, because those cards describe this slide perfectly. And for those of you watching on camera or maybe watching this later, ask us and we'll give you some, because we have hundreds of them and we'll be passing them out all weekend long. So yeah, from a t-shirt cannon. We're not responsible for paper cuts. So let's start with the top, on the record, okay? That means exactly what you think it is. And the easiest way to remember on the record is a very simple catchphrase. Everything you say can and will be used in the story. So if you are on the record, you need to imagine everything you've said as a headline. So when you look at the front page of the New York Times and you said that Apple was boo-boo, well, guess what? You just said Apple was boo-boo, and that's the headline. Everything you say will be used, okay? Now, on background means that I can use what you've told me, but I can't say that you said it. On background is the most common conversation a journalist will have. In fact, 9 times out of 10, if I'm talking with someone at a conference, it is on background. But just because you have an on-background conversation with somebody does not mean they are bound to stick to it. And so the same is with off the record, which we'll get to in a minute, okay? So when you're having an on-background conversation, typically you'll see that translated in the news as sources familiar with, senior administration officials have said. These are all on-background conversations, which means the reporter is free to use what they've said, they just can't attribute it to anyone. And now we're going to get to the big one. This is what trips up most people, because they assume that saying something is off the record is like this powerful shield. And I can promise you it is not. In fact, how many of you would love to have an off-record conversation with one of us right now about something? Let's just say you in the front row, I could see you, so I'm going to pick on you. Let's say you come up to me and you say, hey, Steve, off the record, so-and-so just did this. Well, guess what? We're not off the record. But do you know why? Because I did not agree to being off the record. When you go off the record with a reporter, that is a very powerful type of connection between the two of you. And unless the reporter agrees, you are not off the record.
It's a two-way handshake.
It has to be that way. It has to be a two-way handshake. For those of you who didn't hear it, that's a really great analogy. I like that. I'm stealing it. You're never getting it back. It has to be two ways, though. If the reporter does not agree, you are not off the record. But let's say the reporter does agree. So I agree we're off the record, you asked for off the record, now we're having an off the record conversation. What you need to be aware of is I'm going to take everything you said, and without naming you, without attributing it to you, I'm going to try and find an on the record source. That's my job. It's not because I'm trying to be mean to you, it's because that's my job. I have to try and find on the record sources. My boss is never going to let me talk about something that was written off the record. I can't run a story with 9 off-the-record sources say so-and-so. I can't. I have to find someone on the record. So the easiest way to do that is to go to someone and say, hey, I'm hearing rumors that blah, blah happened to X. What do you know about that? Well, the thing is, blah, blah is the off-the-record conversation, and X is the subject of said off-the-record conversation. I just never named who my sources were. It's very common, but that's something that happens. You have to be prepared for it. Go ahead.
I was just going to add that if you have an off-the-record conversation with one journalist, if another journalist in the room does not have that relationship with you, it's not off the record to them, as President Trump found out with the Toronto Star.
Yes. Anybody remember that story? Toronto Star and the one of the American newspapers, Trump.
This was Bloomberg.
Bloomberg, yeah.
So President Trump was having an interview with Bloomberg, and he said, this is off the record, and Bloomberg agreed. But the Toronto Star got a hold of the conversation and did not agree in advance to that, so they ran him saying, we're never going to make an agreement with Canada. And so that caused some problems for him. Also, everything you do in email, it goes by the same rules. You have to make sure that you have an agreement beforehand that if you're having a conversation off the record in email, that it's off the record.
We'll show you an example of that here in a minute. That's a big one. So, moving forward, when we're going back and forth with some other pitching tips and tricks, I want you to think of those 3 points we just raised, and then check yourself off here. So, once you've established how the conversation goes, and these are rules you set up before the conversation starts. So before you say anything to a journalist, find out if you're on the record, off the record, or on background. But I want you to always assume you are on the record. Always. You should always assume you are on the record. I'm going to say that again. Assume you are on the record. And the reason for that is you only go off record with a reporter if you have a really good relationship with them, meaning you've known them forever. You trust them. How many of you can immediately say, and don't feel bad if it's absolutely none of you, you would implicitly trust the 3 of us to go off the record? Exactly.
Nobody? Really?
And the thing is, I don't blame a single one of you, because unless we've earned that trust, there's no reason for you to ever be off the record with us. None. And that's fine. That's perfectly fine. Our jobs are built around everybody not fighting us one way or another. That's how we do it. So when you're looking at pitching and you're trying to reach out to a reporter and you have this idea of what the conversation is going to be like, some easy things to get the process moving is don't pitch products or services. You heard Sean talk about that one. If you're going to talk to a reporter, don't pitch products or services. You heard us mention that. And of course, don't promote products or services. These are things that stand out to a reporter.
The more altruistic you come off, the more likely they are to talk to you. So, and commerce is not necessarily altruistic. So.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to move forward to an example real quick, since we just talked about it. How many of you saw this headline? A couple of you did. Okay, so what you see above that is Elon Musk's email to that reporter. Notice the first thing he wrote in that email, off the record. Now, show of hands, who believes this conversation is off the record because of that? Exactly. All of you are paying attention. Good morning. Thank you.
Just because you're a billionaire doesn't mean you can make something off the record just by saying so.
So let's look at this email. He starts off incorrectly assuming the conversation's off the record, and then in the second sentence, he calls the reporter, yeah, I'm not going to say that because, I don't want to see the YouTube video get demonetized later for language, but you could see there, he's cussing out the reporter. So does the reporter have any obligation at this point to keep this conversation off the record, or do you think the reporter is going to run a headline stating what was in that email? This is just one of the many conversations you will see in email that end up going so far south, it's maddening. But we chose this example because it's so rare that you get proof someone started the conversation demanding to be off the record without understanding what that means. And the confusing thing here is Tesla's not a small startup. They have an impressive communications and PR machine behind them, so there's no way he can say he wasn't trained on this. And if he was, I really, really want to know why he wasn't. Otherwise, there's no excuse for that. That type of email should have never been sent because, again, if you have a communications department, should you be talking to reporters directly? No.
He probably is the time on the email 4:20?
God, that'd have been great if it was.
Wasn't that his first time smoking pot? That one with the...
I don't know.
I don't believe so. No.
I don't believe it was, because when he took the first hit on the podcast, he didn't cough. Usually the newbies choke themselves out. All right. So the next thing we're going to talk about is, and this is an example, when you're pitching the media, don't repeat negatives. Okay? And what I mean by repeat negatives is if you hear somebody say something bad and you're trying to make a point, don't repeat it. Years and years and years ago, Yahoo, when it was a thing, they were going to buy a little website called Tumblr. And everybody on Tumblr accused Yahoo of screwing it up. You're going to buy Tumblr and you're going to screw it up. Our beloved website's going to go down the drain. And so Yahoo, trying to get ahead of that fear, they issued a statement that says, we promise we will not screw it up. That's the headline that appeared in Reuters the very next day. Yahoo buying Tumblr for $1.1 billion, vows not to screw it up. That is repeating the negative. And
they obviously already screwed it up because they spent $1.1 billion on it.
Yeah, they bought it for $1 billion, which is confusing. So here's the question. How many Tumblr users are of the opinion that Yahoo screwed it up? Probably a handful of them at least. And there's a headline confirming that, they lied about it. So now that's a double negative against Yahoo because they repeated it. And now that they can be held against them. The users have something. You promised you would never do this, but you did. And it's just going to come back. Anybody follow politics? So there was a person running for the Senate, and they repeated the negative although they're the originator of the negative, which makes this a very interesting example. This is Christine O'Donnell, and when she was running for office, she had given an interview on a talk show and said that she practiced witchcraft.
As a teenager.
As a teenager. Well, that story took off, and she tried to run from it by repeating no less than 6 times in the opening section of a video that I am not a witch.
So what's the headline?
The interview, when she made it, I dabbled in witchcraft. Those are her exact words. And then she does this big campaign video with, I am not a witch. I'm nothing you heard. I'm you. And she keeps going over and doing that. That is, again, repeating the negative. So do you think that this video got out ahead of that story and people stopped forgetting about the whole witchcraft thing? Absolutely not. Why would they? She said it 6 times in a video. I'm not a witch. I didn't know you were a witch, but I'm sure you're not now? Huh?
Have you, or are you now, or have you ever been a witch?
Yeah, have you now, or have you ever been? All right, so the last one is going to be Sean here, because this was one that we were requested to discuss.
Yeah, this is. So we were at DEF CON, and I was spending a lot of time in the voting village because I'd covered the voting village when it started, and was talking with Matt Blaze, and then this story appeared where someone in DEF CON Kids doing a capture the flag, an 11-year-old doing a capture the flag that had been set up to resemble the Florida elections website was portrayed as being an 11-year-old who hacked the actual Florida website. And this happened partially because the person who was running the capture the flag may have overhyped what was going on there just a little bit. Just a little bit. So the problem with this is that when you throw something out there and you give it a little more, when you try to sex something up, like, hey, this kid just hacked the Florida website, it ends up discrediting every real story about this thing that comes along after it. So it's a little bit like the boy who cried wolf, right? So it makes it much harder for me to write a story about, hey, Georgia's certificates are all screwed up on their SSL is implemented horribly on their election sites. And Georgia didn't have the same number of votes as voters on their electronic voting machines. What's up with that? And everything else we cover about election security becomes slightly tarnished by an 11-year-old took 10 minutes to change the results of the election. Now, the fact is that kids were able to, within a few minutes, change votes on voting machines in the voting village. And that was a much more important story because, as it turns out, it takes less than 2 minutes on some voting machines to hack them and change results. And in fact, you could use a mobile phone to hack the card you use to vote to allow you to vote infinite times.
But do you see how? Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
But this story is what got the most attention, and it sort of ended up being a smokescreen especially once it was debunked, for all of the other things that were going on. People didn't pay attention anymore.
I think that. Go ahead.
Is it the mistake of the child though, or the journalist?
In this case, it's both. The child was not the one who said this.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was the individual running the capture the flag.
Yep.
And it was also the journalist. In this case, it was a journalist who did not have a lot of experience covering information security.
The key piece of information that was kept out of the narrative when the story was being pitched was the fact that this 11-year-old was trained to spot SQL injection vulnerabilities and trained on how to exploit them.
It was a kid's CTF.
Yeah.
All right. So these kids had been hacking boxes and been popping shells on things for a while, all day long.
Like all day long. It was their thing. And so that narrative is actually kind of critical to the story. Now think back to the smell test, okay? What's left out? What's left out of the story? The fact that this was a kid CTF and the exact vulnerability they found was something they'd been working on all day long. That was what was left out. So that's what happens when you don't ask those questions and something's left out of a story. You get that. Now, ProPublica, when they came out and debunked the entire thing, forced Fast, I think it was Fast Company, that's the very top headline up there. That headline had to be changed, and so did the story, because it turns out, again, we're talking about pre-configured websites that were not the exact, they were just meant to look like them, and known vulnerabilities that were automatically inserted into. They were meant to be there. It's a training exercise. So we're going to cover one more example, and then we're going to open the floor to questions for you. This is important, okay? And Paul is going to be the one to explain this, since this was his idea. Go ahead.
One thing you got to remember, and this is not apparently obvious to a lot of people, is that while most newspapers, most newspapers' op-ed pages and editorial pages do have a particular slant on things, that's not supposed to affect the news coverage. And that is not always firmly true, but it generally is. For example, here's one from the Times, that, the resistance inside the Trump administration. The op-ed page at the Times is run separately from the rest of the paper. It's sort of firewalled off from the rest. They have different standards for evidence, and their sort of political slant is not supposed to affect what happens in the rest of the paper. The same thing happens to the Wall Street Journal, which has a very different editorial stance. It's even true at Fox News to an extent. The daytime stuff is supposed to be straight news, and then you get the opinion in the evening. There is a difference. These different publications do have a choice in what to cover and what not to cover, but once they start covering a story, it's supposed to be straight up. And that is true even at Fox News and CNN. So when you hear that such and such is a right-wing paper or a left-wing paper, that should not affect your opinion of their news coverage, because the news coverage is supposed to be good and it's supposed to follow the rules that we've said here. It's passing the smell test, examining the sources, getting down to the basics, presenting the facts. And we would like you to at least take away that we up here try to adhere to those rules as best we can. We really do. We cannot speak for all reporters, but if you would choose to speak to any of us, please be assured that we will follow those rules.
And this is, again, someplace where you have to take a look at who's writing something and what their track record is before you talk to them. So the New York Times separates its editorial, but there are lots of news outlets, lots of media that present opinion as news.
They call it blended coverage.
Right, so Sean Hannity is not a journalist.
Nope.
Okay, he's a commentator, okay? Yeah. Same is true for any number of people you see on MSNBC. There are also a lot of publications that are specifically aimed at taking a political slant. So whether it be Daily Caller or Talking Points Memo or the Huffington Post, perhaps, or Gizmodo, they have an agenda of their own, right? Whether that agenda be radical truth or something like that. They aren't necessarily following the same rules of editorial ethics that people who do hard news on a daily basis do.
Each of them are on stories that none of us would.
So there's something interesting about this particular editorial, though, that you see on your screen.
Yeah.
When you write an editorial for a paper of record like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, you have to sign your name to it. Your name has to be out there with your opinion, okay? What's significant about this particular story you see in the example is the fact that it was written by an anonymous author. Now, without giving away my age, I could say that I have seen several presidents and been on this earth for quite some time, and I have never once seen an anonymous op-ed in the New York Times. That was a first for me, and it blew my mind.
It blew several people's minds.
The standard of what this person was writing about and talking, and the level of proof that they had to have given the editorial board at the New York Times to be allowed to write something anonymously is astronomically high. So that tells you a little bit about who it was and what they were doing, because the Times does know the name of the author. They're just never going to release it. And it's just amusing because Imagine how awkward it is in the Times newsroom to where this comes out and other reporters are assigned to write stories determining who the author is, but they can't talk to anybody in the newsroom to actually discover the name of the author. Imagine how what kind of work environment that created that week. It had to have been amusing, to say the least. So this is it for us. We're going to do a Q&A now. We are reporters. Feel free to ask us anything. And just before we start, I'm going to make it very clear. You are being recorded, okay? Therefore, nothing said in this room can be considered off the record. You do have a camera on you. Thank you.
And we do have 10 minutes for Q&A, so we'll start with the gentleman right here.
So I have a question. As an information security professional, when we're faced with reading stories in the news, sometimes we have to act on our manager's app because if the Bloomberg Supermicro story as an example, we have no ability to validate that information.
Congratulations on being the first person to bring up the story that all three of us knew was coming. You win, sir. You win.
So the question was, using the Bloomberg story about Supermicro as reference, how do you determine the quality of that reporting and when you're planning on taking action about it, or if you have to take action on it?
And that is not an easy question to answer, so I'm going to do my best. Okay, the first thing you need to do is look at your experience in the industry and what that story is talking about. So in this case, you're talking about a supply chain attack against a well-known vendor from a possible nation state, okay? So you need to take all of that information and your experience, and I want you to make a gut check right now. Do you think you're at risk of having your corporation attacked by a supply chain attack from a nation state vendor? If so, what's your risk level? How do you respond to that? Where is your company on the policy slide right now to be able to deal with something like this? That's where you take that story and how you push further. That's what you answer your boss when they're questioning you about this. Thing is, do you use Supermicro? No. So does it apply to you? Probably not. But is that something you need to consider with your vendors? Maybe. So what are we doing to protect ourselves against this? What assets are in place that can literally lower our risk?
So really, the long and the short of it is, look at your own threat model, do threat modeling against the news. Yeah. And then also consider the sources that were named, if there were named sources. And there were no named sources in this story. Right? There were a lot of denials about this story, right? So what was the vendor response? The vendor response was, we won't want to comment. Then you think there's probably something there. It doesn't help that in this case, there was a history of bad things happening. So I reported on a problem Apple had with Supermicro a year and a half ago. And it was in a very isolated incident in a test lab. They found a server that had bad firmware, that had malware in its firmware. And that's a totally different story than this one. But it was used as sort of support for this story. So the key is that, first of all, you should assume as an information security professional that the world is on fire all the time anyway. Right? Yeah. Prepare for the worst anyway, especially when you're talking about management modules on your servers. Make sure that your networking and stuff is shut down to not allow that kind of traffic to leave your network. Right? But also know that some of this reporting is speculative. Some of it is maybe it was a competitor of Supermicro saying, hey, I know a way to throw these people under the bus really bad. Yeah. And so you have to balance it. And you have to also balance it in whether you think a state actor would really want to have access to your baseboard management controllers. So the point is, look at your threat model. How does this story affect me? Are the sources good? If the sources are good and it affects me directly, then yes, that's put it in my action line. If it's an indirect effect, or if it's it's just something that you should be aware of, you may want to alter how you look at your supply chain security.
But also look at the story skeptically.
Sorry.
You should always look at stories skeptically. Even the best reported stories, you should look at skeptically.
Did we get your question? Is that good? If not, hit us up after this, and we can keep talking about it, because it's a very valid point.
Hey, come to us after.
Yeah, we'll get into that offline. Go ahead.
So this kind of rips off of what he was talking about. As consumers of the news, we get bombarded with tons of stuff a day. And as you said, there's reporters, bad reporters, and everything in between. Well, I'm not part of that tribe, so I don't know who is who and what organization is good or bad. How is us as consumers able to kind of get a gist on, what is real, what's not, what's being,
You read.
Yeah.
You read and you take your experience. So let's say your background's in just straight network engineering, and I'm a reporter who writes about network gear all the time, but every story you read of mine is wrong. And you know it's wrong because you work in this field. You see the same gear I'm writing about, but every time I write about it, I get it wrong. That's a journalist you're probably not going to trust.
You should also, to be quite honest, you should look at how often somebody actually quotes a real human being.
Yeah.
And how often they refer to something they got on background or to, so as a practice, for example, myself, I prefer to never use on background in a story. I never say somebody doesn't want to be named because, for whatever reasons. The New York Times does that because that's the only way they can get their stories in some cases in the political world. But if somebody's coming to me to talk to me about something that's a problem that's in the commercial world, not in the government world, I'm never going to go on background. But in any case, look at the quality of their sources. Look at how many people they've talked to in the story. If it's a single source story, it's probably got a lower level of credibility. Look at, and the other thing is look at the outlet in general and see if there's a certain feel for what their type of content is, and looking at other sources that have reported on that and see if there's correlation. So you have to look across multiple sources of a story, multiple outlets to determine whether that story matches up with what other people are saying.
Yeah, and it's literally just read. Go ahead.
So as an exercise in smell testing, using Supermicro, as a reference, what would you have done differently than Bloomberg?
That is a question I'll have to answer offline. I can't stand here on stage and say that. Yeah, I can't stand here on stage and say that. No, right over there in the green.
Okay.
Real quick question, verifying the journalist credentials if your company doesn't have a PR department, somebody approaches you to do a story, what's the best way?
The question was, if your company doesn't have a PR or communications department, how do you verify a journalist's credentials? And it's really simple. A journalist by ethics is bound to tell you, I am a journalist for so-and-so, which means you get to call so-and-so and say, hey, does Steve Ragan work for you? And guarantee you they will. Now, if they're a freelance or a stringer journalist, they usually have a business card, and you are able to easily look up their work. You could Google them. You could look at other articles they've written. You could check out their social media profiles. You could do your diligence on a journalist and easily tell that they are a journalist, because most of us do not hide. It does me no good to hide the fact that I'm a journalist. So like if you look up, actually, if you just type my name into Google, the first thing you're going to see is a series of stories I've written. It's just a thing. Yeah, we got time for one more, and then we're gonna have to.
If I have an ongoing relationship with a journalist and they approach me for a comment on a story that I can't or don't want to comment on, how do you frame that, and how do you continue to have a productive relationship after that?
If you ever, so the question was, if I have a really good relationship with a journalist and they come to me for a comment on a story that I can't or do not want to comment on, how do I address that while maintaining the relationship? And the answer to that question is, if you have a good relationship with that journalist, the fact that you don't want to or can't comment on it will have no bearing on your relationship with that journalist.
We will understand.
Yeah, we do. We understand that completely, because there's going to be a time to where I'm going to ask you a question about a story or something I'm working on, and I know that you're familiar with the topic, or you may even have something worthwhile saying, but you simply can't comment. And I get it. I understand that.
We won't hold that against you.
No.
Honestly, especially like on my beats, since I cover a broad number of beats, and they include defense and national security. I have relationships with people who I know that when they say they can't talk to me about something, it's not personal. Yeah. It's something where they just can't talk to me about it. They may suggest a channel to me to explore the story, and if that's something you want if that's something you want to throw to somebody to help them forward to the story, but you don't want to contribute to it or be involved in it yourself, you can say, you should probably talk to this person to get the best official on the record kind of comments about this. that will help forward things. But that would be what I would, otherwise, don't worry about it. Just say, sorry, can't help you this time.
Exactly. No harm, no foul. It's good.
All right, DerbyCon, that's been our talk. Thank you for coming out this morning.
We got these cards. Send up the cards.
So we will be able to have plenty of conversations with you offline. If you did not get one of our little cards, let me know, because we have hundreds of them, and I would very much like you to have tips and tricks.